a game which I think goes a little bit into Crazy Town. Because first of all, almost all dice are halved. 1 to 3 is a failure, 4 to 6 is a success. Mm-hmm. And it's a 6-sided die. And you're rolling some dice. You get that many successes. Mm-hmm. Only very rarely do you just look at the number of successes and say, that's my degree of effect. Typically, you need to beat some target value. You say, if you don't get 3 successes, then you fail. And then you have the opposed rolls, which stand in for that same effect when someone else is doing something active against what you're doing. This isn't the only game that does this, but a game that really goes to town on this is Burning Wheel. Because the number of modifications is vast, particularly with all the traits that could factor into this and all the circumstances that could factor into this.
Right.
What's frustrating about it is that it has sort of the white wolf effect of if each die is variable in success or failure, and the result is graded against someone else's result, ultimately most victories and failures are only going to be a die or so of difference.
That's kind of what I've been
difference, right?
Design.
So you end up all going through all this fucking work. And basically, it's I fail by 1 point or I succeed by 1 point almost all the time.
Right.
So do you see kind of, I'm not saying that necessarily has to be the case. When I played Burning Wheel quite a long time ago, in fact, this was back in revisions that people don't even remember existed back then.
Mm-hmm. Right.
We had characters. This was with ancient classic original Burning Wheel with the notes for the revision in hand. Which is probably why I never can remember how the damage works, because I was like trying to process the changes. But I do recall, though, and this part isn't very different if you're looking at the basic game, we were playing all elves, which in Burning Wheel are very, very distinctive, elevated, eldritch beings. And I had them start with a very large number of life paths, 6 or 7, which is a lot. A typical Burning Wheel character begins with 3 or 4 life paths. I had them at 6 or 7. We were talking about old fucking elves.
Yeah.
They were all, and this is a fairly restricted game, they were also all what are called outriders. I said, however you get to being an outrider through all the life paths, get there. So you're a band of outriders together, and you could have had all kinds of different backgrounds. 6 or 7 life paths to get there. Go. And of course, you ended up with these incredibly neurotic, rich tapestries of characters. And they had like bazillions of things about them. I bring this up because they also had really effective things. When they were riding their horses through the forest in an unfamiliar forest, and a whole bunch of human archers popped up and tried to take them down with a log jam, that fell in front of them and everything. Fuck, man, they just started singing, and they bewildered all the humans, and they just were able to take their shots at leisure, punctured the humans in a few places. The humans are bewildered and failing their steel tests all over the place, and they just casually jump their horses over the logs and keep going, still singing. It was just like classic, you don't fuck with the high elves, okay?
Right.
But I also had the primary non-player character in this circumstance, who is actually a priest, who had a faith score who'd also been through a number of life paths and a military background. So in Burning Wheel terms, he had a high steel, which was gray. A gray steel means that you get a success on a 3 or higher, not a 4 or higher per die.
Gotcha.
With faith of that level, steel, and with steel of that level, and with a high faith score, and what they had was 2 foster elf children whom he had converted, so that they had faith, not grief, for their emotional characteristic.
Right.
with a number of fairly ordinary humans, but who all had like faiths of one or two. And with the fact that that faith can make use of other people's faith, those elves ran face first into conflicts of interest and circumstances that they could not fathom, and that their dice battered up against in a very unpredictable way. So do you see how I was able to find a way by picking the right variables, and having the elves had a large number of dice based on beefing up all of those scores. But they also had very high grief, which in the case of the emotional characteristics can be a form of vulnerability. Putting them up against this rock-solid faith with lower effectiveness values, but with this rock-solid body of faith and being able to change the world in ways the elves just can't understand. Now we're talking about some pretty bouncy outcomes.
Yeah.
But to tell you the truth, I don't think I would play Burning Wheel unless something like that was going on. Unless the various different pieces of the system found a way to open up yawning voids of unknown consequence. Because otherwise, I feel as though the whole thing is basically an exercise in determinism. And determinism is fine, but why should I go through all that work to get it? Right. So does that make any sense as well?
Yeah.
Okay. Those are pretty much the principle-based issues to bring up. One last one, which I think is another one of those not really have to dwell on it things. I keep saying dice. It's obvious we could be talking about any randomizing method, right?
Right.
One of the tricky things is that the word diceless has been an abomination in role-playing marketing. Ever since Amber made the word diceless sexy. And I will give it to Amber, it is actually diceless.
Yeah.
But many games were published over the next 10 years, which, for example, took a deck of cards and then had a success system graded on that particular numerical scale. And you drew a card to see what the die said. And of course, they lost no time plastering the word diceless all over their covers.
Right.
So let us not get distracted. Sometimes people will use cards in a fashion that are very wonderful for the properties of cards that are not the properties of dice. Swords of the Skull Takers is an interesting example, I would say, being one of the few that really made use of the tarot deck, in my opinion. A lot of games want you to use a tarot deck because basically it's a cool factor. But a few of them actually use tarot in an interesting way. Others use a poker deck in an interesting way. With or without familiar card mechanics involved. To pick a bad example and a good example, in my opinion, Deadlands had a card system by which you kept drawing cards, and you basically built up, kind of a poker hand for the kind of resolution you wanted. And then when the time came, you were able to slap it down. Of course, you didn't want to get caught short by some other conflict that your cards weren't suited for. And you, what's the word I want? You were using literal poker, gradation for it. You had to, basically play poker to some extent, because you could see and raise, as I recall. So I don't remember if you could or not, but it was definitely a very laborious mechanic for something which really was just a die roll, and when it was absolutely no different in terms of resolution than if they had just stuck with the dice mechanic that they had for everything else, because I think that was for the Magic or something.
Yeah.
So far, so good?
Mm-hmm.
Then you take Dust Devils, which does use the poker hands as a scoring system, but you don't play poker.
Right.
It's a much simpler thing. You're not actually comparing hands, you're just getting a hand, and that's how many points you get. And then finally, there is the interesting case of Cold Soldier, in which you are incrementally gaining and losing cards through rounds of play, and you often, and you bank some of the cards as you go. You often, if depending on the situation, may find yourself sacrificing something that you've banked. And at the end, you take your banked cards and you draw 5, put them all together, and build the best poker hand you can. So you're trying to influence your poker draw at the very end, but you can only influence it, and there are times when you suck it up, and you know you're not. Because you don't know what those 5 cards at the end are going to be. You can influence it, that's the best you can do. So, but it's only one poker draw at that time. So all of these games are messing with the existing scale of poker hands and some degree of risk and assessment of whether to play or not to different degrees. So they're trying to use not only just cards properties, but poker as a quality, as a piece of the resolution. I think they vary greatly in their success in doing that. Other things people say that cards can do that dice can't. One of them, if at the end of every draw you just return your cards to the deck and then you do the same deck over again for your new draw, then it really is more like dice. If, on the other hand, you eliminate cards from play as you use, the probabilities of the deck change as you go along, which doesn't happen with dice.
Right.
So there are some things to consider. There's also, even though you could, we typically think of dice being rolled de novo and you didn't have anything as a fixed value to lay down when you're talking about dice. I mean, you could roll like 5 dice in the beginning and then you have those sitting there as values, right? I mean, you could.
Yeah.
So you could have a hand.
Yeah.
We just don't do that with dice. It's just not part of our cultural, way to go with them. Whereas with cards, we are equally comfortable with draw from you have nothing in your hands, draw from the deck 2, and that's your result.
Right. Versus
saying you always have 4 in your hand, and when you draw 1, then you pick 2 to use.
Right.
We're culturally okay with cards having that property and dice not having that property.
Right.
So those are just some of the differences. I mean, there are real differences sometimes in the physicality of the instruments, but it is also just as often in role-playing history that we just treat the other instrument as dice as a gimmick. I mean, we just use them as if they were dice.
Right.
So where are we at in the conversation? Do you think we've covered a fair amount of what to deal with?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to think about. Would you mind, can you think of a game where the outcome becomes less certain as you play through the conflict, like in the way that you were talking about,
Right, less certain rather than more. In many games, it's kind of like circling the drain, right? The more along we go, the more inevitable the outcome becomes, right?
Exactly.
Well, let's see here. And you're not talking about changing up the tactic in a dramatic way, like suddenly, finally, he cast the fucking fireball that we all were begging for him to do 3 rounds ago.
Right.
We're not talking about that. Sorry, hold on. It's hard to separate that from shifting tactics.
Mm-hmm.
Shifting a tactic would be like in Tunnels and Trolls when one of the characters decides to go for a saving roll instead in a way that upends the whole conflict. takes himself out of the collective damage roll, attack damage roll. So reduces our collective effectiveness, but they've got a good shot at doing something pretty impressive right there that will really change things up for us. So that's a change in tactic that would render the outcome vastly less predictable than it seemed to be doing, at the time.
I kind of like that because one of the things I like the idea. It was a provocative question, but then I'm also very interested in agency for the players. Where I want balance, but I want their decisions to be meaningful.
Well, the obvious way is to have tactics that you can invoke at a risk, like the Tunnels and Trolls one. Another one is in Sorcerer, where although it is not a banking effect, rolls can generate bonus dice for the next roll. And although that puts visions in people's heads of chains that, grant you mountains of dice, that typically isn't quite as common. But every so often, something can happen. It is more likely to happen toward the end of a series of exchanged rolls than at the beginning. It is more likely to happen at the end that you get an effect which is going to land you with a significant number of dice. Here's an excellent example. In Sorcerer, if you take enough damage, the momentary damage, to stun you and you're just dropped in your tracks. Now, not enough necessarily to kill you, but maybe enough to kill you too. It doesn't matter. The point is that the total damage, including the temporary damage, is enough to drop you. In Sorcerer, your characters have an ability that other characters don't have, and it is to roll their unmodified will score, or rather, I should say undamaged will score. They can roll that against a number of dice that they want to use. What's interesting, the smart thing to do is to roll against only one die. Instead of saying, I really need a whole lot of dice, well, I'll roll my will against 6 dice, hope I can use 6 dice. No, roll against one die. First of all, put your heart into the will roll, which isn't hard to do, by the way. Players always do that. Your character's just been flattened, and they're like, I'm getting the fuck back up, right? And they mean it every single time they say it. And you're like, well, that's worth a bonus die right there. So you roll your will plus 1 against one die. Count the victories, because those victories will roll into you rolling with the one die. So if you succeed by, say, 4 dice, you're going to roll that one die plus 4 more dice, so that's 5 dice. And so the situation that the character is getting up with a spear through them, basically. Or, they've been one punched and are just totally flattened. And, obvious, and everybody is reacting to this as if it happened that way. And then the character gets up and does what they want, how they want, right now. The fictional circumstances of that mechanic, the necessary fictional circumstances of that mechanic, plus the facts that you're getting an unpredictable amount of dice to use that could be reasonably high. And then the possibility, not given, but a possibility at any time, that a whole lot of victories on a given roll gives you a whole lot of bonuses to use on your next roll if it's related. That can you got a whole lot on that one. And you're like, wow, I'm going to do something that pertains exactly to what I just did, which isn't very hard. And you get all those as your bonus dice. You can see people rolling 10 or 12 dice in Sorcerer sometimes, and that kind of thing, since it relates to the fiction and the circumstances that have been occurring in both, with or without that will roll mechanic, means that kind of thing always tends to happen toward the end of the conflict rather than the beginning. Does that help?
Yeah, I think it does, yeah.
There are a couple of others. The way that I design champions now was to increase the stochasticity of outcomes. In other words, you roll dice to make things less certain rather than more certain. And that a big part of that was to get away from the idea that, you know, Electro can beat Mysterio, but Mysterio can beat, you know, beta villain, right? In other words, you have this gradation of who can beat who throughout your whole superhero universe.
Yeah.
I'm getting away from that. Get in a fight, look out. So the way that I did this in Champions Now was to focus on the interplay of running out of energy, so that the more heroic things you try to do as you go along, the more you risk knocking your own self out or making yourself more likely to be taken out by a hit. So without actually going down, like the character actually going out of play, you're making yourself more vulnerable to going out of play the more you do. And the villains are in the same circumstance, and so they're doing a lot to give you, the heroes, priorities that are not getting in their way. So they would much rather have you go off and save the kitten while they go and finish what they were doing. Thank you very much.
Right.
And but the point is if the characters are going head to head with the determination to literally take one or the other down, as you get closer, the results become less predictable rather than more, because each one is burning their energy reserves and taking more and more and more intense action. Because as you know, the other one's energy reserves are going down and they may start burning into their knockouts, then you know that you are able to hammer them. Your chance of hammering them with a knockout of your, blow of your own is much, much better. Much more so than it would have been in the beginning of the fight. Does that help a little bit? Both of those are pretty good examples of designs of mine that are aiming very heavily toward making the end of the fight consequential, causal from what already happened, but not just a grind down of what we saw was going to happen.
Right. It seems like a lot of the examples have to do with, how to put it, making decisions that invoke greater risk over the course of a conflict play.
I completely agree. That's what will do it. Because you have to decide whether to do it or not. And all of a sudden, again, remember what we said, how we talk is how we roll. That has to do with caring. When a die roll reflects the degree to which you care, then it's fun. And I'm trying to, and of course, as you can see, that's what gives people who favor fatal or potentially fatal saving throws to go all the way back to 1974. Do you see why they actually have a point? At least they're caring when they roll.
Right.
And if a person of that ilk or preference derides a more, sort of probabilistic model the world inch by inch, bit by bit kind of play, they may have a point. A lot of those games, you're not really caring about any given roll.
Yeah.